The faded emblem on the letterhead caught Dr. Aris Thorne's eye, a raven clutching a key. The Blackwood Asylum Historical Preservation Society, a grand name for an obscure group. They had granted him complete access to the asylum, a place sealed off from the world for over 60 years. His research proposal, on a strange idea he called architectural memory, was accepted instantly. No questions asked. The asylum was a Gothic skeleton on a remote peninsula, always silhouetted against a grey, moody sky. Locals whispered stories about it, ghostly nurses, the cries of forgotten patients. But Aris was a man of science. He wasn't here for ghost stories. He was here to prove a theory, that intense emotions could leave a measurable imprint on a place. It was a wild idea, blurring the lines between psychology and something else. He packed his gear meticulously: digital recorders, EMF meters, thermal cameras, everything he needed to capture the unseen. Blackwood was infamous, not just for its ghosts, but for its brutal treatments in the early 20th century. Hydrotherapy, insulin comas, and the horrifying transorbital lobotomy all happened within its walls. It was the perfect, if grim, case study. The society sent him a single, heavy iron key and a hand-drawn map. A note was attached, written in a spidery, elegant script. It read, "Dr. Thorne, what is forgotten is not always gone. We trust you will be respectful of the residents." Residents, not former patients. A strange choice of words. It was almost as if they believed the asylum was still occupied. As his car crunched down the gravel path toward the imposing gates, Aris felt a nervous excitement that wasn't purely academic. The building was massive, oppressive. Its dark windows looked like vacant eyes staring out to sea. He was here to find the psychological echoes of past suffering, but as he put the key in the rusted lock, a chilling thought hit him. What if those echoes could still scream? The huge oak doors groaned open, breathing out a cloud of cold, stale air. It smelled like decay, dust, and old paper. The entrance hall was a grand mausoleum. Dust covered everything, from the cracked marble floors to the ghostly shrouded furniture. Sunlight struggled through filthy arched windows, illuminating dancing dust motes in long ethereal beams. The silence was heavy, profound. It felt like the building was holding its breath, waiting. Aris set up his base in what looked like the old administrator's office. It was large, with a mahogany desk and towering, empty bookshelves. He started his work methodically, placing audio recorders in the main hallways and taking baseline EMF readings. The meters were silent. The building seemed as dead as you'd expect after 60 years. His first stop was the records room, located in the sub-basement, according to his map. The winding stone staircase was unnerving. Every step echoed in the oppressive dark, and the air grew colder, damper. The room was behind a heavy steel door, thankfully unlocked. Inside, metal shelves were overflowing with decaying cardboard boxes, a treasure trove of history, a library of forgotten lives. He pulled a random box from a shelf. The cardboard crumbled in his hands. The label read "Patient Admittances, 1932. Inside were dozens of files, each one a life boiled down to a few pages. The doctor's language was cold, clinical, painting a bleak picture of suffering. Diagnoses like female hysteria and moral insanity were everywhere, convenient labels for anyone who did unfit society's mold. As Aris sifted through the brittle pages, he felt a growing unease. These weren't just records. They were paper tombstones. He found the file of a young woman, Eleanor Vance, admitted for melancholia and vivid nightmares. A photo was clipped to her file. She had haunted eyes that seemed to hold a deep, unspoken terror. It was her story he was here to understand. Days blurred into a week. Aris fell into a routine. Days in the dusty records room, evenings reviewing data in his office. The building remained a silent, sleeping giant. His recorders picked up nothing but the groan of settling foundations and the sigh of wind through broken windows. But the feeling of being watched never left him, a primal sense of being observed by unseen eyes, especially in the deeper levels of the asylum. He decided to focus on Ward C, the former maximum security wing. This was where the most difficult patients were kept, and where the most extreme treatments were used. The ward was at the far end of the west wing, a long dark corridor lined with heavy steel doors. Each door had a small barred window and a food slot at the bottom, a design built for isolation and control. As Aris stepped into the ward, the temperature dropped so sharply it made him shiver. His thermal camera showed nothing, no scientific reason for the sudden chill. He walked down the corridor, his footsteps the only sound. He stopped at a cell halfway down, the number 13 barely visible. Peering through the grimy window, he saw a small, bare room. Scratched into the far wall were hundreds of vertical lines. The desperate calendar of a forgotten soul, and that's when he heard it. A faint, almost inaudible sound. A woman humming a lullaby. He froze, holding his breath, listening. The melody was beautiful but deeply sorrowful, and it seemed to come from the very walls around him. He raised his audio recorder, pointing it down the hall, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Only the profound silence remained. He tried to rationalize it. The wind playing tricks. Old pipes contracting. His own mind desperate for a result. But the melody had been too clear, too human. He played back his recording, cranking the volume to maximum. And there it was. Beneath the hiss of static, he could just make out the faint, ghostly trace of the humming. It was his first piece of unexplainable data. The first sign that the building's memory wasn't entirely silent. The humming in Ward C sent Aris diving back into the patient files. He had to find a connection. He cross-referenced the names of patients from the maximum security wing with admittance records. It was slow, painstaking work. Many files were damaged by water and time. He scanned for any mention of unusual phenomena, shared hallucinations, or specific figures that might appear in different patient accounts. He found it. Tucked inside the file of a patient named Thomas Weaver was a small, leather-bound diary. Weaver was a journalist, admitted in 1941 for paranoid delusions. He claimed his investigations into a local politician had made him a target, but his diary wasn't about his own supposed madness. It was a meticulous record of life inside Blackwood. Specifically, life inside Ward C, Cell 13. Weaver's entries started lucid, observational. He described the daily routines, the cold orderlies, the despair of his fellow patients. But then, the tone shifted. He started writing about the sounds at night, whispers that slithered through the cracks in the walls, and a recurring figure he and other patients called the Collector. According to Weaver, the Collector wasn't a ghost, it was a presence, a shadow that lingered in the corner of your eye, a feeling of cold dread that would settle over the ward. He wrote that patients who saw the Collector became withdrawn, their conditions worsening rapidly. They'd talk about losing memories, feeling like parts of themselves were being methodically erased, or collected, by this unseen entity. A cold knot tightened in Aris's stomach. Weaver's descriptions were too specific, too detailed to be simple delusion. He described the Collector's humming a soft mournful lullaby that always came before its appearance. It was the same melody Aris had heard. The journalist's terror felt real, bleeding through the faded ink, a 60-year-old warning that he was not alone in the asylum. Armed with Thomas Weaver's account, Aris now had a specific thread to pull. He began a systematic search through the archives for any other mention of the Collector. He spent the next 2 days combing through hundreds of files, his eyes sore from deciphering faded handwriting and medical jargon. The work was emotionally draining. Each file was a story of a life interrupted, a mind lost in the labyrinth of illness and institutionalization. Then the pattern began to emerge, slowly at first, then all at once. He found another reference in the notes of a Dr. Evelyn Reed, a young psychiatrist who worked at Blackwood in the late 1930s. Her notes described a contagious hysteria in Ward C, where multiple patients reported seeing a shadow man and hearing a disembodied humming. She theorized it was a shared psychosis, born from the ward's oppressive environment. Then he found another piece of the puzzle, and another patient's frantic letter to her sister, intercepted by the staff, begged to be saved from the man who steals thoughts. An orderly's incident report described finding a patient in a catatonic state, muttering the word Collector over and over again. Each account had been isolated, dismissed by the head doctors as a symptom of individual madness, but when pieced together, they formed a terrifying mosaic, a hidden history of Blackwood Asylum, far darker than he could have ever imagined. Thanks for watching. If you want to see what happens next in Blackwood Asylum, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This was no longer just about folklore or the psychological imprint of an environment. This was a specific, recurring event, documented over a decade by different people who had little to no contact with one another. The experiences were just too consistent. The humming lullaby, the peripheral shadow, the feeling of mental violation, it was all there, hidden in plain sight within the archives, a secret history of terror buried under layers of clinical dismissal. Aris realized the scope of his research had fundamentally changed. He wasn't just studying an abstract phenomenon. He was investigating a series of events, a specific entity or psychological virus that had plagued Blackwood Asylum for years. The entity known as the Collector was real, at least in the minds of those who had been trapped here. The question now was what, or who, it truly was. The asylum took on a different character after dark. During the day, it was a place of history and silent decay. At night, it felt alive. The wind whistling through cracks sounded like whispers. The settling groans of the old structure mimicked footsteps in the hall. Aris had always been a rationalist, but the cumulative effect of the isolation, the silence, and the disturbing stories he was uncovering began to wear on his psyche. Sleep became a luxury. He would lie on his cot in the administrator's office, listening to the building's nocturnal symphony, his mind replaying the desperate words from the patient files. He started hearing the humming again, faintly, at the edge of his hearing. He would sit bolt upright, his heart pounding, straining to locate the source, but it was always gone in an instant, leaving him to question his own senses. He began leaving audio recorders running throughout the night in his office and the adjoining corridor. In the morning, he would spend an hour listening to the recordings, scrubbing through hours of silence for a few seconds of an anomaly. More often than not, he found nothing, but on the third night he captured it. A clear, though distant, recording of the same sorrowful lullaby he had heard in Ward C. The sound lasted for nearly a minute on the recording before fading out. Analyzing the waveform, he could see it wasn't a trick of the wind. It had a distinct, repeating melodic structure. The terror of the discovery was twofold. First, it was irrefutable proof that the sound was real, an objective phenomenon. Second, it had been recorded just outside the office where he had been sleeping, a chilling proximity that felt deeply invasive. His scientific detachment was beginning to crack. The line between observer and participant was blurring. The asylum was no longer just a subject of his study. It felt like it was studying him back. The stories of the collector, of thoughts being stolen, echoed in his mind. He found himself double-checking his notes, suddenly afraid of forgetting details, of losing pieces of his own mind to the oppressive silence of Blackwood. Driven by a mix of academic curiosity and a growing sense of personal dread, Aris shifted his focus from the patients to the staff. If the collector was a real entity, human or otherwise, its history must be tied to the asylum's administration. He began looking into the records of the head physicians who presided over Blackwood during the period when the sightings were most prevalent, from the early 1930s to the late 1940s. One name appeared repeatedly: Dr. Alistair Finch. He was the chief of medicine for that entire period, a man lauded in public records for his innovations in psychiatric care and for running an orderly, efficient institution, but there was very little information about him personally. He was a man who seemed to exist only in official documents and sanitized newspaper articles, a public figure with no private history. In the grand entrance hall, among portraits of the asylum's founders and benefactors, was a large, oil-painted portrait of Dr. Finch. Aris had walked past it dozens of times, but had never truly looked at it. Now he stood before it, studying the face of the man who ran Blackwood during its darkest years. The artist had depicted him as a stern, authoritative figure, with piercing grey eyes and a thin, unsmiling mouth. The eyes were what held Aris's attention. They seemed to possess a chilling intensity, a cold, analytical gaze that felt almost predatory. There was no warmth, no hint of the empathy one would expect from a doctor. As Aris stared at the portrait, the ambient light from the window seemed to shift, casting strange shadows across Finch's face. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, he thought he saw the lips curl into a faint, knowing smirk. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light and his own frayed nerves. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this man, Alistair Finch, was the key. He was the common denominator, the one constant presence during all the documented appearances of the collector. The official history painted him as a pioneer, but the stories hidden in the patient files suggested a much darker truth lay buried with him. The hand-drawn map provided by the Historical Society showed a section of the third floor marked simply as private and no admittance. It was Dr. Finch's personal wing, containing his private study, research laboratory, and living quarters. Unlike the rest of the asylum, the heavy oak door leading to this wing was locked, not just with a simple knob, but with a heavy, industrial deadbolt that had no corresponding key on the ring Aris was given. This sealed-off section became an obsession for Aris. If Dr. Finch was connected to the collector, the answers had to be behind that door. He spent a day searching the administrator's office for a master key, checking every drawer and cabinet, but found nothing. The Historical Society had been clear. He was not to force any locks. It was a rule he was now seriously considering breaking. He examined the lock closely. It was old but well made, impossible to pick with his limited skills. Frustration mounted. The building was holding its most important secrets just out of reach, guarding the history of the one man who might explain everything. He felt as if he were in a chess match with the asylum itself, and it was always one step ahead. The silence of the halls seemed to mock his efforts. That night, as he sat in his office reviewing his notes, he heard a new sound. It wasn't the humming. It was a faint, rhythmic scratching, coming from the floor directly above him. He froze, listening intently. The sound was slow, deliberate, like a nail being dragged across a wooden floor. He checked his map. The room directly above his office was located within Finch's sealed wing. It was supposed to be empty. The sound continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly, plunging the asylum back into its profound silence. Aris did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk, staring at the ceiling, every nerve on edge. The asylum was no longer passive. The scratching felt like a direct communication, an invitation, or a threat. He knew then that he had to get into Finch's wing, regardless of the rules. The next morning, Aris returned to Dr. Finch's portrait in the entrance hall, a new, desperate idea forming in his mind. He stared at the painting, at the cold, calculating eyes, and the hand resting on a thick, leather-bound book. He had been so focused on the man that he had overlooked the details. He ran his fingers along the ornate, gilded frame, searching for any hidden latch or mechanism. He found nothing. He then stepped back and looked at the wall around the portrait. It was wood-paneled, just like much of the asylum's administrative areas. He began tapping gently on the panels, listening for a hollow sound. Panel after panel produced a solid thud. He was about to give up when his knuckles rapped against a section just to the right of the painting, and the sound was different, a subtle, yet distinct, hollowness. With his heart pounding, he pressed against the panel. It gave way slightly. Prying at the edges with his fingers, he managed to dislodge it, revealing a small, hidden compartment cut into the wall. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, ornate brass key. It was heavier than the other keys and bore the same raven emblem as the one on the letterhead from the Historical Society. He knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the key to Finch's private wing. The placement was too deliberate, too theatrical, to be a coincidence. It was as if Finch himself had designed this small puzzle, a test for anyone who might come looking for his secrets. It felt less like a discovery and more like he was being led, guided by an unseen hand through a carefully constructed narrative. Clutching the key, he felt a wave of triumph mixed with a heavy sense of foreboding. He was about to cross a threshold, both literally and figuratively. The Society's rules, the professional boundaries of his research, they all seemed insignificant now. The pursuit of the truth about the collector had become personal. He was no longer just an observer. He was now a participant in Blackwood's lingering horror story. The brass key slid into the heavy lock with a satisfying click. Aris turned it and the deadbolt retracted with a loud metallic thud that echoed down the empty corridor. He pushed the heavy oak door open, revealing a space that was startlingly different from the rest of the asylum. While the other wards were decayed and covered in dust, Dr. Finch's private study was immaculately preserved, as if it had been sealed in time. A large polished desk stood before a tall window overlooking the stormy sea. The air was still and cold, carrying the faint scent of old leather and antiseptic. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with medical texts, but with tomes on philosophy, esoteric arts, and ancient history. On the desk, an old phonograph sat next to a neatly stacked pile of patient files. Their labels bearing names Aris recognized from his research. This was the nerve center of the asylum, the very place where life and death decisions were made. Aris suspected it was also the birthplace of the collector. He moved toward the desk, his attention drawn to a specific file on top of a pile. It belonged to Eleanor Vance, the young woman with the haunted eyes from the photograph he had found on his first day. Her file was much thicker than the others, a testament to her prolonged torment. Suddenly, the scratching sound he'd heard the night before started again. This time, it wasn't distant. It was coming from the corner of the study itself. Aris spun around, his flashlight beams slicing through the gloom. The room was empty, yet the sound was crystal clear, the distinct scrape of metal on wood. It seemed to be coming from a large, steel filing cabinet tucked away in a shadowed alcove. This was it. The source of the terror was locked away inside that cabinet. If you find yourself captivated by the chilling history and psychological terror of places like Blackwood, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that like button. Your support is what enables us to bring these forgotten stories to light and explore the real history behind the horror. Now, let us return to the study, where Aris was about to unlock the final, and most terrifying, secret of Dr. Alistair Finch. The filing cabinet was not locked. Aris pulled open the top drawer with a loud, grinding screech of metal. It was filled not with paper files, but with dozens of small wax phonograph cylinders, each carefully labeled with a patient's name and a date. He quickly cross-referenced a name, Eleanor Vance, with the file on the desk. The dates on the cylinders corresponded perfectly with her treatment sessions with Dr. Finch. This wasn't just a cabinet. It was a library of recorded sessions, a collection of nightmares. He carefully took one of the cylinders labeled with Eleanor's name and placed it on the phonograph in the corner. Taking a deep breath, he lowered the needle. A hiss of static filled the room, followed by the faint, tinny sound of a woman's voice, trembling with fear. It was Eleanor. She was describing a nightmare, the exact same one mentioned in her file. She spoke of a dark room, a feeling of being watched, and a sorrowful, humming lullaby that never seemed to end. Then, another voice joined the recording. A man's voice, calm, measured, and completely devoid of any warmth. It was Dr. Finch, but he wasn't comforting her. He was questioning her, his voice like a scalpel, methodically dissecting her fear. "Describe the shadow, Eleanor," he commanded. "Describe what it takes from you. We must understand its nature to collect it." The words sent a shiver down Aris's spine. Finch wasn't trying to cure her, he was studying her terror. He was cultivating it. He quickly played another cylinder, this one belonging to Thomas Weaver, the journalist who had vanished within these walls. Weaver was not describing a delusion, he was defiantly accusing Finch. "You are the collector," Weaver's voice crackled from the phonograph. "You are the one who haunts these halls. This isn't madness, it's an experiment." Finch's calm reply was even more chilling. "Madness is merely a deviation from a baseline, Mr. Weaver. We are simply recording that deviation." In that moment, Aris realized the horrifying truth. The collector was not a ghost, a spirit, or a psychic imprint left behind by tragedy. It was Dr. Finch himself. He had created the legend, using sophisticated psychological manipulation, perhaps even hallucinogenic drugs, to induce a specific, shared delusion in his most vulnerable patients. He was an architect of fear, a scientist of terror. The whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, they were all part of his monstrous, systematic experiment on the human mind. Stunned by the revelation, Aris spent what felt like hours listening to the wax cylinders. Each one was a testament to Finch's unimaginable cruelty. He was a psychological predator, preying on the deepest fears of his captive patients. But to what end? Simply documenting their terror seemed too simple for a man of his apparent intellect and ambition. There had to be a greater, more sinister purpose behind his elaborate, decade-long experiment. The answer lay in a thick, leather-bound journal Aris found in a locked drawer of Finch's desk. This was not a diary of daily events, but a research log, filled with Finch's precise, almost microscopic handwriting. The title on the first page made his blood run cold, "On the Tangibility of Consciousness and the Isolation of the Psyche." It was a direct, albeit hideously twisted, parallel to his own research into architectural memory. Finch's hypothesis was radical and terrifying. He believed that intense emotional states, particularly fear, could cause a fragment of a person's consciousness, their psyche, to be momentarily externalized. He theorized that this externalized energy could then be captured, recorded, and studied, much like a biological specimen. He wasn't just creating fear, he was attempting to harvest it, to collect the very essence of his patients' souls. The journal was filled with scientific observations, but they read like the ravings of a madman. Finch detailed his methods for inducing what he called maximum psychic extrusion in his subjects. He used gaslighting, sleep deprivation, auditory manipulation like the humming lullaby, and carefully orchestrated visual stimuli to create the shared entity of the collector, which was, in reality, his own projected persona. He was both the scientist and the monster in his own twisted experiment. The asylum itself was his laboratory. Finch believed the very stone and mortar of Blackwood could act as a container, a sort of psychic battery for the emotional energy he was harvesting. He wrote of wanting to create a permanent echo, a place where the consciousness of his subjects would be forever trapped for his study. The curse of Blackwood Asylum was not a ghost story. It was a deliberate, malevolent act of psychological engineering. Among the wax cylinders in the filing cabinet, one stood apart. It was unlabeled and sealed with a thick wax cap. It felt heavier than the others, more significant. With trembling hands, Aris carefully broke the seal and placed the final cylinder on the phonograph. The static that hissed from the horn seemed louder, more agitated than before. Then, a voice filled the room. A voice he now knew intimately. Dr. Alistair Finch. It was his final journal entry, recorded just days before the asylum was officially closed in 1953. His voice was different. The calm clinical detachment was gone, replaced by a tone of frantic, feverish excitement. He spoke of a breakthrough, a final stage of his experiment. He claimed he had found a way not just to capture the psychic echoes of his patients, but to integrate them, to merge them with his own consciousness. "They call me the Collector," Finch's voice crackled, laced with a triumphant madness. An apt title. "But they do not understand. I am not merely taking, I am preserving. I have built a library of souls within these walls, a chorus of terror that sings to me, and now, I shall become the librarian. I will join them, not as a memory, but as the permanent, guiding consciousness of this place." He described a procedure, a combination of psychoactive compounds and a self-administered electroshock therapy, designed to sever his own consciousness from his physical body and permanently imprint it onto the structure of the asylum. He believed he could achieve a form of immortality, becoming one with his life's work. He wasn't just the architect of the curse, he intended to become the curse itself, the ultimate terror. The recording ended with the sharp sound of a switch being thrown, a powerful electrical buzz, and then a final, agonizing scream that dissolved into static. Aris stumbled back from the phonograph, his mind reeling. Finch had not just haunted the asylum, he had tried to become it. The presence Aris had felt, the humming, the feeling of being watched, it was the lingering, fragmented consciousness of a madman, still clinging to his kingdom of suffering. As the final scream from the phonograph faded into nothing, the atmosphere in the study changed. The oppressive silence was replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the walls, the floor, the very air around him. It was not just a sound. Aris could feel it in his bones. The building was awake. Finch's final act had somehow, impossibly, succeeded in turning the asylum into a vessel for his malignant will. The door to the study, which Aris had left open, slammed shut with a deafening bang. He rushed to it, but the handle wouldn't turn. He was trapped. The humming grew louder, coalescing into the familiar, sorrowful lullaby, but now it was coming from all directions at once, a disorienting, maddening chorus. The room grew impossibly cold, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen and stretch, coalescing into a tall, thin shape near the filing cabinet. It was vague, indistinct, but unmistakably human in form. The Collector, Finch. It wasn't a physical entity, but a distortion in the very fabric of the room, a focal point for the asylum's concentrated psychic energy. Aris felt a pressure in his mind, a cold, intrusive presence trying to pry its way in. He remembered the words from the patient files, the man who steals thoughts. He understood now. Finch wasn't just trying to scare him, he was trying to collect him, to add his consciousness to the library of souls trapped within Blackwood. The academic exercise had become a desperate fight for his own sanity, for the integrity of his own mind. He was now the final subject in Dr. Finch's eternal experiment. Aris backed away, his scientific equipment a useless collection of plastic and metal against this psychological onslaught. His knowledge, however, was not. He was a psychologist. He understood the power of the human mind, its resilience, and its breaking points. He could not fight this presence physically, but perhaps he could fight it mentally. He had to ground himself, to resist the terror that Finch was now weaponizing against him. The real test had just begun. Thanks for watching. The journal was a blueprint for pure psychological terror. Dr. Blackwood theorized that the human mind could be systematically broken down and reshaped just by controlling what it sees and hears. He wrote about using low-frequency sound waves, what we call infrasound, to literally create feelings of anxiety and dread. These frequencies are just below the range of human hearing, but they create vibrations that people would feel as a supernatural presence, a ghostly touch, or that unshakable feeling of being watched. Chloe traced a diagram in the Journula map of the asylum's entire ventilation system. It had been retrofitted with what Blackwood called acoustic resonators. These were devices hidden inside the vents to broadcast silent frequencies throughout the entire building. The whispers on the walls weren't ghosts of the past. They were a carefully engineered illusion, designed to prey on the most vulnerable minds. It was a constant, subliminal suggestion of insanity that became a self-fulfilling prophecy for so many patients. A cold wave of revulsion washed over Liam, far worse than any fear he had felt before. The curse of Blackwood Asylum wasn't paranormal. It was technological. It was the result of a depraved, calculated experiment to manufacture horror. The ghosts were a lie, a cruel stage play orchestrated by a doctor who had violated his oath in the most profound way imaginable. turning a place of healing into a laboratory for breaking the human spirit. He looked from the journal to the strange, humming device in the corner of the hidden office. Wire snaked from it, disappearing into the walls, connecting to the very systems Blackwood had described. The low hum they'd been hearing wasn't the building settling, it was the machine, still active. A horrifying realization began to dawn on them. The experiment had never truly ended, and they were its newest subjects. The machine's low, persistent thrum was no longer just background noise. It was the active pulse of the asylum's lingering malevolence. Dr. Reed approached it cautiously, his flashlight beam dancing across dusty dials and archaic vacuum tubes that glowed with a faint, sickly orange light. A small, tarnished plaque identified it as the environmental resonance modulator. This was the heart of the entire system, the source of the manufactured dread that had saturated these walls for decades. It seems to be on a low-power automated cycle, Dr. Reed murmured, his voice tight with a mix of academic fascination and genuine alarm. The primary power grid for the asylum is dead, but this must be connected to some kind of independent, long-term power source. A backup generator, perhaps. It has been running maybe for 60 years, broadcasting its subtle poison into the very air of this place. Liam's journalistic instincts were at war with his primal urge to run. They had the story of a lifetime, a discovery that would rewrite the history of Blackwood Asylum and expose its scientific horrors. But leaving now meant leaving the machine active, a silent trap waiting for the next group of curious explorers or urban developers. The thought of anyone else experiencing this calculated terror, even for a moment, felt like an unacceptable moral failure. They had a responsibility to stop it. "We have to shut it down," Chloe said, her voice firm, echoing Liam's thoughts. "We cannot just walk away and leave this engine of misery running. It would be like finding a buried landmine and not marking it for anyone else." Her historian-esque reverence for the past now demanded action to protect the future from its most toxic remnants. The decision was made, not with bravado but with a heavy sense of duty. Their new mission was clear: trace the thick, insulated cables leading from the modulator and find its power source. They had to venture deeper into the asylum's decaying bowels, following the very wires that carried the building's artificial curse. The system they now understood was the same system they had to confront. A journey into the heart of a machine built to simulate the very essence of a haunting. The heavy cables led them from the hidden office down a flight of crumbling service stairs into the asylum's sub-basement, a place the original blueprints had marked simply as utilities. The air here was thick and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth, ozone, and decay. The low hum was much louder now, a physical vibration that resonated deep in their chests, making their teeth ache and their vision seem to swim at the edges. This level was a tangled maze of pipes and conduits, a metallic jungle where shadows danced and played tricks on the eye. The infrasound was more concentrated here, and its effects were intensifying dramatically. Chloe felt a growing pressure behind her eyes, while Liam had to fight a rising, irrational panic that made him want to scream. Every clank of a loose pipe sounded like footsteps. Every draft of cold air felt like a spectral touch on his neck. Dr. Reed, though also affected, forced himself to focus, analyzing the infrastructure. Kirkbride asylums often had their own power plants, he explained, his voice strained against the oppressive hum. They needed to be self-sufficient. Blackwood must have diverted power from the primary generator's emergency backup. "We are looking for a control room, a junction that isolates this system." This clinical focus was his defense against the encroaching terror. They rounded a corner and saw it. In a small, cage-like room, a massive, ancient generator sat silently, but next to it was a smaller, more modern-looking diesel unit, the source of the hum. A series of heavy-duty switches and breakers were mounted on a panel on the wall, the cables from the modulator terminating right there. This was the nexus, the central point from which Blackwood's psychological plague was broadcast. As they approached the control panel, the hum seemed to swell in intensity, the psychological pressure becoming almost unbearable. A sudden, loud bang echoed from the generator, and the flickering emergency lights in the corridor went out, plunging them into absolute darkness. Armed only with their failing flashlights, the machine wasn't just a passive system, it now felt as if it were actively fighting back to protect its own existence. Panic surged in the pitch-black corridor, a primal fear amplified by the machine's oppressive hum. Liam fumbled with his flashlight, its beam finally flickering to life. "Weak but steady, Chloe." "Dr. Reed," he called out, his voice sounding small and thin. Their own beams cut through the darkness a moment later, finding each other in the oppressive gloom. The generator hadn't exploded. A circuit had likely just overloaded, a common occurrence in such old systems. The panel, Dr. Reed said, his voice a bastion of calm in the chaos. It should have a master breaker. Look for the largest lever, likely red. They moved as a unit toward the cage, their beams converging on the bank of switches. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on their arms stand up. The infrasound was at its peak, a crushing weight on their minds that whispered of failure and despair. Liam's hand, slick with sweat, closed around a large rusted metal lever set apart from the others. It was coated in decades of grime, and for a terrifying moment, it refused to budge. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with the effort as Chloe and Dr. Reed held their lights steady. With a deafening screech of protesting, rusted metal, the breaker finally gave way, clanking down into the off position with a deeply satisfying finality. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the deep, pervasive hum that had been their constant companion simply stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was profound, almost deafening in its completeness. It was more than just the absence of noise, it was the absence of pressure, the feeling of being watched, the crushing anxiety, the creeping dread. It all evaporated in an instant, like a fever breaking. They stood there for a long moment, breathing an air that suddenly felt clean and light. The asylum was still a place of profound sadness, a monument to past suffering, but the malevolent presence, the active source of terror, was gone. They hadn't banished a ghost or broken a supernatural curse. They had simply unplugged a machine. The true horror was not in the haunting, but in the cold, human calculation that had created it. They emerged from the asylum into the cool, pre-dawn air as the first light of morning painted the eastern sky in soft shades of gray and purple. The building behind them was once again just a derelict structure of brick and stone, its power to inspire active terror silenced forever. It remained a place of tragedy, but the weapon hidden within its walls had been disarmed. The weight of its history was still present, but the oppressive, engineered evil was gone. In the weeks that followed, Liam published his story. It wasn't the sensational ghost hunt he had envisioned, but something far more important and disturbing. His article, co-authored with Chloe and with expert testimony from Dr. Reed, detailed the discovery of Dr. Blackwood's experiments. It exposed the asylum's darkest secret, shifting its legacy from a local ghost story to a documented case of unethical human experimentation. The story caused a sensation, prompting a formal investigation by the State Historical Society and medical ethics boards. The asylum was permanently sealed, not as a haunted site, but as a crime scene and a memorial. There was a renewed push to identify the many unnamed patients buried in the asylum's cemetery, to give them back the names and dignity that had been stolen from them in life. The focus shifted from fear to remembrance. Liam, Chloe, and Dr. Reed had faced a profound terror inside those walls, but it was a terror born of human cruelty, not of the supernatural. Their experience served as a powerful reminder that the greatest horrors are often not the ones that defy explanation, but the ones that we can understand all too well. The real ghosts are the memories of what people are capable of doing to one another, and the duty of the living is to ensure those stories are told. They had entered Blackwood Asylum searching for a legend and found a truth that was infinitely more chilling. They had silenced the whispers in the walls, replacing a manufactured horror with a quiet, solemn respect for the real victims. The curse was broken, not by ritual or exorcism, but by evidence, empathy, and the simple act of turning off a switch, allowing the real souls of the asylum to finally rest in peace. Thanks for watching.